Alrighty, here we are. Everybody, Steve here from The Varied Life on YouTube. You can check that out on YouTube, and I'm also posting this on Facebook. The Varied Life is a YouTube page where it documents a mishmash of things, and one of those things is where the wife and I, we ended up selling everything we owned, the house, the car, the truck, the guns, the ammo, the pots and pans, everything in the kitchen junk drawer, and we threw stuff in a couple of suitcases, and we ended up retiring here in Korea. So yeah, overseas retirement, that's kind of a big thing. And there are many differences if you go to visit, vacation, or retire overseas. So with that being said, there's a lot of similarities, but there's some differences as well. And it's important that we know those differences, and that will kind of give us a guide on how we can act when we're overseas, just to keep us and others safe. So the way that we do things in the United States might be different than they're done overseas and vice versa. So when it comes to self-defense laws, and I'm going to be talking about Korea, other countries might be similar or a little bit different, but because I'm retired here in Korea, we're going to talk about the self-defense laws. Now, this has come up because in my prior life of living in the United States, I was a firearms instructor, I was a Krav Maga instructor, certified in that. I taught CCW or concealed carry weapons classes. I did carbine classes. I taught people how to use firearms. I was a contractor as part of a contract team that taught the military police at Fort Carson how to use their weapons and shoot, move, and communicate and do all that kind of good stuff. So I've had a great time when it comes to self-defense, and part of the classes that I give is on the law aspect of Colorado and what all that entails, castle doctrine, stand your ground, the Make My Day law, which isn't really a good law, it's just kind of in name only. But when we're in the United States, we have this idea of self-defense and what it means. And oftentimes, people from the United States will go to a different country, and that country has the same words, self-defense, but how those words are defined and how they're put into action in foreign countries can be similar, and there can be some differences. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So yeah, living in Korea is very different. Besides the obvious size difference, the population in the United States is about, 330, 340 million people. Korea has about 50 million people. And the atmosphere of both countries are different. There seems to be, Korea is more homogenous. In other words, there's more one nationality than what we see in the United States with a bunch of different nationalities and races and so on and so forth. But it's Korea. That is their country, and they've been around for thousands and thousands of years, and the United States has only been around for a few hundred. So there's a lot that we can glean from other countries. Now, in Korea, when we talk about self-defense, you are afforded the opportunity to defend yourself, and that is good news. But the way that you do that is different than in the United States. So we're going to go over some of these things. Talking about what we have here is what to do when you're attacked in Korea. Now, this is kind of interesting because you'll get a lot of information if you look on Korean law blogs or their websites in regards to criminal law and how foreigners should conduct themselves, and kind of like, well, what happens if you get attacked? This is kind of a Barney basic little list here, as you can see here. First, try to contact the police. You should not be on your own or ask for the help of strangers. When facing a serious or potential threat, contact the Korean police by dialing 112 or 119. 112, I think, is the line that will get you to an English-speaking law enforcement personnel. Secondly, it talks about the duty to retreat. Courts may advocate that a victim first make an attempt to avoid further confrontation before relying on violence. Your case will look a lot stronger if you make an attempt to escape the situation rather than applying force from the start. Third, contact your respective embassy and they will help you out in some way, shape, or form. This seems to be kind of the cut and paste response that I see on a lot of Korean law office blogs, and so on and so forth. So that comes into play. But with that being said, kind of in the United States, if there's an altercation and there's violence, then what do they suggest you do? Call the police. Try to remove yourself from the situation. You have a duty to retreat. So we kind of see that in the United States as well. And then as far as contacting the embassy, that's not really a thing. But, for Koreans that were living in the United States or visiting, they might want to contact their embassy to get help as well. So this is really solid based information, but it's really generic. Now, when we get into the situation of self-defense, it's kind of different, and we're going to look over a few things. So in Korea, when we talk about self-defense, there is a number of things, and basically it's covered by Article, let's go back to this page here. Basically, it's covered in the Korean Constitution of Article 21.1. And self-defense is defined as an act which is performed in order to prevent impending and unjust infringement of one's own or another person's legal interest shall not be punishable if there is a reasonable grounds for that act. Now that sounds pretty similar to what we have in the United States, that you're afforded the opportunity to protect your life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness against assaults and attacks, and you have grounds to respond with force if force is being used against you. Number two, it talks about when preventive act has exceeded normal limits, the punishment may be mitigated or remitted according to extenuating circumstances. So an act to keep somebody from attacking you has exceeded normal limits, and how do they go about judging what are normal limits? This is where we start to get into the nuances of Korean law versus laws in the United States. 3, in the case of preceding paragraph, an act performed through surprise or fear, surprise, or excitement or confusion in the night or under other extraordinary circumstances shall not be punishable. So in other words, kind of a reaction of, somebody's attacking and you kick them and it causes them because you're surprised or scared for your life, kind of similar to what we see in the United States, that you're in fear for your life or severe bodily injury or death, that you react in such a way that, that's the only thing that you can do. It won't be punishable. We kind of see that in the United States as well. Regrettably, Article 21 of Korea's Criminal Act is viewed very narrowly. So there's a very narrow definition, and there's a lot of things that come into play when it comes to self-defense. And there's some very interesting nuances that should give you pause if you get into an altercation. So when we talk about this, let me see if we can find the other... what is a preventable act? It's an act is about stopping a threat before it escalates within reasonable limits. This means that you may not cause excessive injury to your attacker to prevent bodily harm. This is the key point, not cause excessive injury. Well, how do you know if there's excessive injury? Well, according to Korean law, if an injury, let's say somebody attacks me and they're the perpetrator, they're the criminal, they're trying to rob me or whatever, and I'm the victim, and it ends up that I push them away, that creates distance and I can run away. Boom, I'm good to go. I can report that to police and then the perpetrator will get charged. However, if I cause excessive injury, and this is determined by the amount of injury that he incurs and the amount of stay that he is in the hospital recovering, that seems to be the definition that we need to really look at. So in the same example, somebody attacks me unprovoked and I push them and they fall back and crack their head and break their nose or whatever it is, and their stay in the hospital is 3 weeks or more, then I am liable for that excessive force. In other words, it's no longer deemed as self-defense. Now it's deemed as excessive force on my part. Now, let's say, what happens if somebody attacks me and I push them away. They have a bar and I push them away, and they trip over a rock or a can or a curb in the road, and they fall and they hit their head and they go to the hospital and they stay there for 3 weeks. What is the outcome of that? Well, according to the courts, because of my action, even though he accidentally tripped over himself or the curb or whatever it is, and even though he might have intended to kill me, because it resulted in a 3-week or more stay in the hospital, I am now liable for his injuries. So going back to that original little blurb that we saw on a Korean law office blog of saying you have the duty to retreat, they really mean it, okay? Because, what is the definition, if it's 3 weeks in the hospital? Well, if somebody is willing to attack me and do me harm and try to rob me and they're a bad person and so on and so forth, do you think a bad guy would lie about their injuries or the extent of their injuries so that they can stay longer in the hospital to remove the self-defense from me, and now I am liable for the injuries that he's incurred? In other words, he's going to get a lesser sentence. I'm going to get charged with some things, and we're going to have to pay some money. And I think that is entirely reasonable for a criminal to lie about the extent of their injuries, to try to stretch out their hospital stay to get to that 3-week mark. So that way it limits their liability, it increases my liability, and it's a way for them to kind of a loophole from what I see, in my opinion. It is really, really interesting. So when is self-defense justified? Self-defense is justified in the face of an immediate or unjust threat. When is it not justified? Well, initiate a fight or provoke an attack that voids the right to claim self-defense. So in other words, you can't do a preemptive strike on somebody, which is similar to what we see in the United States. Just because you think somebody is going to do you harm, you can't attack them as a preemptive strike, because that would not be classified as self-defense. The use of excessive force uses preemptive strikes even in response to verbal threats. So if somebody calls your mama a name, or you a name, or your wife or significant other or whatever, that does not give you the right to put hands or attack someone else. Now, it also says that the defense must not be more aggressive than the assault. Excessive force, particularly using a weapon or causing significant harm, is not justified. And here's the nuances that we're talking about. In the United States, we see kind of similar things, that you can't overdo and undue punishment or excessive force on a person that you're defending yourself from. There's a point of where you're allowed to use a level of force that will stop that person, the appropriate level of force to stop that person from doing what they're doing, and not go above that. Let's say you push somebody off of you and they fall to the ground and you stomp on their knee and you break their leg, or, kick them in the ribs and break their ribs. That's an example of you've gone too far. As soon as that person went to the ground, you have created distance, and that should give you time to get you and your family members, your loved ones, out of the way. So again, going back to the excessive force of causing significant harm, again, that 3-week stay in the hospital, you got to keep that in mind. So for victims, the legal recourse is that victims can file a criminal complaint and pursue civil damages. There is also, in Asian countries, and since Korea is one of those Asian countries, compensation and settlement money is something that's a thing. Victims are entitled to compensation for damages. Settlements can be negotiated between the two parties. Restitution. Now, let's talk about the compensation and settlement, the negotiation between the two parties. Here in Korea, if there is an altercation, even it comes to car wrecks or, physical altercations, they will try to negotiate and mediate it at the lowest level before taking it to a court. And you should know that the courts have a very narrow definition of self-defense and how they enact it, because of things like excessive force, the hospital stay, and how that comes into play. So when it talks about restitution, the courts may order attackers to cover the medical expenses, lost wages, etc. With that being said, the courts can also rule in favor of the perpetrator, because if I push that person and they fell, knocked their head, and they spend more than 3 weeks in the hospital, I can be liable for their medical costs as well. So again, this is where the mediation comes into play, and the negotiation of compensation and settlement, where it's like, okay, well, you did this and you did this, you pay this, and then they try to wipe the slate clean. It's an interesting way of doing things, and we kind of see something similar in the United States, but usually it's a judgment by a court against the perpetrator, and it's handed out that way. So the notable points is severity of punishment based on, for the attacker, the unjustified self-defense or unjustified self-defense. Penalties range from fines to imprisonment based on the severity of the attack. So remember, if you are deemed to have unjustified self-defense because of excessive force and what they deem as excessive force, you can be fined and or imprisoned. So for minor assaults, up to 10 million Korean won, which is about $7,600. There's also imprisonment. For the first-time offenders may be placed on legal watch, or what they call probation in the United States, for up to 2 years. Very interesting. For serious injuries or weapons use, and this is another interesting caveat, in the United States, I would open carry, I would conceal carry, I would carry knives, I would have a baton, a lot of different things that I would carry with me depending on the situation and what I was doing, or the work I was doing as well. So with that being said, here in Korea, if I use an item as a weapon, that can be deemed as excessive force depending on the injuries that are incurred by that perpetrator or the other person. So for serious injuries or weapon use, the imprisonment ranges from 1 to a maximum of 15 years. And again, that's all dependent upon the injuries and the severity of those things. The severity of punishment based on injury extent. Injuries requiring over 3 weeks of treatment may incur more severe penalties. So again, we kind of see this give and take, this cause and effect relationship when you get into an altercation. Settlement money. Settlements can lead to reduced sentences or drop charges if agreed upon by the victim and the court. And then if you're charged with unjust self-defense, the court can also side with the perpetrator, and you might have to pay some money as well. So there's a lot of interesting things that come into this. So when we talk about, we did that, and what counts as excessive force. This is really interesting. Exceeding the force used by the attacker, especially if injuries require over 3 weeks of treatment. And again, if you're dealing with somebody who's a criminal, it's not unreasonable to assume that they would exaggerate their injuries to get to that 3 week or more mark. So keep that in mind. What if I'm charged with excessive self-defense? In cases where self-defense is deemed excessive, the court may mitigate or remit punishment based on the circumstances, especially if the action was taken in fear, surprise, or confusion. So if it can be proven that, yes, you were surprised, you were in fear for your life, there was confusion, and you just kind of acted out and whatever, then that will be taken into account. But that's very hard to prove. So if you have witnesses, if you have CCTV footage or phone videos or whatever it is, those things can work in your favor. But here in Korea, it's not really the job of law enforcement to go get that information or that data or those videos or those statements as much as it is in the United States. So keep that in mind. What if both parties are injured? In cases of self-defense where deemed excessive, the court may mitigate or remit punishment based on the circumstances. Can self-defense be claimed inside homes? This is really interesting because in the United States, when it comes to self-defense, you usually have something that's called the Castle Doctrine. So if somebody breaks into your house, you have the right, generally in the United States, to protect yourself, your loved ones, and others, and even your property in some cases, from that attacker, and you're allowed to use force. the appropriate level of force. So you have more self-defense rights within your home than you do out in public in the United States. However, it's a little different here in Korea. Korean self-defense laws do not distinguish between inside and outside home scenarios in self-defense cases. Excessive force in home invasion cases may still lead to criminal charges for the perpetrator and the victim. And the problem with this is that in an altercation with another individual who breaks into your home, and if there are no witnesses or there's limited witnesses, then it ends up being a he said type of situation. And who are the cops going to believe? Really, they're not really going to take sides on anyone because they're going to go through this mediation process and the negotiation and everything that we just talked about. So again, excessive force in a home invasion, if somebody breaks in and if they trip by their own fault and get hurt, they can lie and it can be, you're liable for that. Now, if somebody breaks in at dark 30 in the morning and they have a pipe or a baseball bat and I throw a chair at them and it injures them and they have to spend 3 weeks in the hospital, even though I was under the threat of severe bodily injury or I thought I was going to die because he's going to knife me and kill me, stab me, even though I used a chair to defend myself, if it caused injury that resulted in 3 weeks or more treatment in the hospital, I'm going to be liable. Doesn't really seem the same as in the United States, does it? So, again, we're in a foreign country. We have to follow their rules and laws. So it's something to be aware of. So when we get to a situation, it's like, well, what am I going to do when somebody breaks into the house? A better question would be, how am I going to harden my house to make my house less of a target for criminals? Do I have deadbolts on the doors? Do I have a security system on the windows and access points? So on and so forth. Do I have a camera system within the house that could help prove that I was right and this person was wrong, or whatever the case may be? But still, we need to recognize that there are some big differences between Korea and the United States when it comes to self-defense. Consequences, we talked about the fines and imprisonment and legal actions that a victim can take. They can pursue legal means for infringement of their rights, and that starts with reporting it to the police. Now, the other question is, will self-defense laws in Korea change in the future? Well, just like in the United States, way back when, everything was kind of a free-for-all. The laws for self-defense were loosey-goosey, and they weren't really for the victims. And over time, the United States has changed its stance in regard to self-defense and made changes that people could better protect themselves than they did before. And that's what we end up seeing in Korea as well. It's really interesting because there's a lot of different case law that we can take a look at. And let me see if I can find this. We're going to take a look at this case law. So, for example, in 1964, a woman who was 18 years old was sentenced to 10 months in prison and 2 years probation for biting the tongue of a victim who kissed her against her will. In 1964, I wasn't even born. I was born in 66. Although the defendant claimed it was self-defense, her argument was not accepted, and she was declared guilty of aggravated bodily injury. However, this case gathered national attention in 2021 with the Me Too movement. Thankfully, the court's view on this has changed since then. Similar case in '89, a completely different verdict was handed down. The victim was a man who assaulted a woman and kissed her against her will. Then the woman bit off the victim's tongue and severed it. Wow. At least it wasn't a Lorena Bobbitt type thing. The court declared the defendant not guilty because her action was self-defense to protect herself, and that was in August of 1989. So we see this progression of having a self-defense law that didn't have a lot of teeth, that didn't really protect the victims as well as it should have, and a number of years later, they changed it so it does. Case study number 2. In 91, a defendant was suffering from domestic violence for over a decade, and she was threatened that she would be killed. She was beaten mercilessly as while she was pregnant. Of course, the defendant claimed self-defense, but nevertheless serves 3 years in the first trial. Many felt it was an opportunity to bring prejudice against housewives in Korea to the surface. The trial continued, and the final outcome 3 years of prison and 5 years probation. The story does have one positive outcome, and the case led to the formation of the Special Act on Domestic Violence in 1997. Sadly, the court's view on this case hasn't changed much since then. A similar case in 2001 saw the same outcome. The defendant was a longtime victim of domestic violence who killed her attacker to protect herself while being beaten. Many Korean scholars have criticized the outcome of this case, arguing the case should have been self-defense or at least excessive self-defense. And we see some of the similar in the United States at times. And it's important that these things come up to show that, hey, you have somebody who's controlling all the money. You have somebody who's obviously bigger, stronger, who has constantly put a spouse, a female, in a position where they're threatened with their life and they're beaten. It's just not right. So the self-defense laws should be expanded, in my opinion, as they have in the United States. Case study number 4, a brother beat his sister while the husband was watching. So yeah, family gathering, argument ensued, so a fight between the two men broke out. The brother was a large man while the husband was smaller by about 20 kilograms, 2.2 pounds per kilogram. When the brother threw down the husband and straddled his chest, he pressed or choked his neck. The husband grabbed a fruit knife to stab the brother in the leg. The husband was charged with bodily injury despite pleading self-defense, and this was in March of 2000. So yeah, it's very interesting on what we see. Clearly, he was in fear for his life. He's being choked. He thought he was going to die. He grabbed what was available, a knife. He stabbed the man in the leg, and it was still deemed as excessive force. So yeah, charged with bodily injury despite pleading self-defense. Again, the totality of circumstances comes into play, and in the United States, most likely this would be ruled in favor of the victim. But again, there's a totality of circumstances. Could this person, do something else or do another action in which he wouldn't be involved in that altercation? In other words, the duty to retreat. It's hard to tell without knowing more details of the case. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting information that comes when we talk about not retirement in Korea, but self-defense in Korea. And let me see if I can find out some other interesting things. No, that's not it. There was the article in the Korea Times that we can take a look at, as we can see here, and it talks about the self-defense here in Korea and how sometimes it's nothing but in name only. And this was written in 2018, updated in 2020. So a stranger made an unprovoked attack on a man in his 30s. To protect himself, the man grabbed the attacker and threw him to the ground. Again, creating distance seems to be a good thing. That's what we would expect and what many people teach for martial arts or self-defense classes in the United States. The altercation left the man with serious injuries, including a broken nose, which the doctor said would take 6 weeks to mend. On the other hand, the assailant suffered only a few scratches. The police concluded that both men were responsible for the fight, in which, according to the police, both attacked each other and suffered injuries. So because of the injuries and because the hospital stay for the perpetrator ended up being 6 weeks to mend, it wasn't classified as self-defense, but it was classified as a fight, as both people, and yeah, they just kind of went from there. Now, Korea has a stand your ground law, but as we read before, you have a duty to retreat, and more often than not, lawyers will recommend that it's better to run away and live another day than to engage in violence against another person, even if they attacked you with no provocation. It's just kind of interesting how this comes about. Many believe the law is nothing more but in name because of its lack of flexibility for the victims or the defenders. Under law, people are allowed to use force to prevent the infringement on one or another person's legal interest, but as precedents, the police guidelines show, deems using weapons and inflicting injuries on the attacker would take more than 3 weeks to cover from is unreasonable, and a standard that many find impossible to meet in reality. And to this I would add that it's very reasonable that a bad person would, again, exaggerate their injuries to stretch out that recovery period just so they could get a lesser sentence, so that, the victim would be deemed as they're responsible for, paying for the medical bills of the perpetrator, and they just try to they did just try to cover it over and say, okay, well, you're both wrong, and so let's just mediate and, done it over. Let's handle it at the lowest level. Police don't want to give the impression that they are taking sides with anyone. This is very important. Now, this is from Kwok Dae Kyung, professor at the Police Administration Department at Dongguk University. This is why police are cautious about making a conclusion that one of them did so for self-protection or self-defense. And he also goes on to say there are too many petty altercations for police to handle. It just takes too much time and effort to find out exactly what happened with physical evidence for every single case. So the thing I need to point out here is that here in Korea, they see this as there's too many altercations going on. But that's from their perspective. In the United States, we've got way more altercations. And again, we have, there's many places where police departments and law enforcement are understaffed, and we kind of see that here in Korea as well. So that's another thing that needs to be taken into consideration. If you do get into an altercation and you can't get away and you have to respond with force to protect yourself or somebody else, know that the police are not going to go to the extremes like we see on the law enforcement shows on TV or real life law enforcement of let's get the security camera from this CCTV system, and let's get the Ring doorbells, and let's see if somebody has video, and we'll canvass the area to find out what really happened. There's not a lot of that in Korea, and in some places in the United States there's not a lot of that as well. So realize that if you are in that type of situation, you might have to be the one to gather that information and that proof to show or try to show that it was self-defense on your behalf. Because remember, if there is no proof, it ends up being relegated to a he said, you're both at fault. So the courts interpret the law very narrowly, which is the key issue. Lawyer Kim Young-min said, as long as the court's current interpretation stands, there's few things police and prosecutors can do to change it. Excuse me. Now, this is what we see in the United States as well. The wheels of justice and getting change within the legal system turn very slowly at times, and that's the same in other countries as well. Again, the reasonable limit. Also, Koreans shouldn't treat situations in Korean inside homes differently from the outside. And we talked about a little bit about that. Excessive force. Nearly all states in the United States allow people to use deadly force to protect themselves inside their homes based on castle doctrine. The legal notion that your home is your castle and you have the right to use any force to defend it. Many states also have laws that expand use of deadly force beyond their homes. But change may be coming because there are petitions that have been going on since 2018 and 2020 to revise the self-defense laws. So, it's kind of interesting on what we end up seeing in regards to self-defense and what is available. So knowing the similarities and knowing the differences of whatever country that you're going to visit, vacation, or retire in, you need to be made aware of those things so that you can make the appropriate decisions if you get into that situation. Now, I was taught at an early age when I was actually taught my very first self-defense class. In other words, I was a snot-nosed teenager, and me and a buddy, we wanted to get into self-defense and martial arts, because we wanted to be badass. We wanted to do that kung fu, taekwondo stuff, and we wanted to be the big men on campus, even though we were small and skinny. So with that being said, we took a self-defense class, and our instructor, the very first class was meet me at this city park and wear some sweats, show up at this area, and we'll start our first class. Our first class involved running sprints for 2 to 3 hours. Shuttle runs back and forth, more sprints, come back, sprint, come back. It got to the point of where it almost made you throw up. And at the end of the 3 hours, we were dying. We were like, oh, we can't take any more of this. You've got to be kidding. And this was the very first lesson. He said, this is the most important lesson of martial arts and self-defense. If you are not there, you can't get hit. If you're in a situation, you have the opportunity to run away fast to remove yourself from that situation. Because if you get in a fight, you're going to get hurt. And if there's weapons involved of any sort, there's going to be a lot of damage. If somebody pulls a knife, the amount of damage that a knife can do is just horrible. And believe me, I know this because I worked in prisons for 11 years. I've seen people get stabbed. I've seen the results of stabbing victims. I've seen, officers get stabbed and seen the photos of what have happened with a homemade knife where they were sliced open. And it is horrible. So that lesson in and of itself, for me at a very young age, showed that, hey, it's not about ego. It's not about any of those things. It's not like the movies. You need to remove yourself from the situation and don't put yourself in that situation to begin with. My grandmother used to tell me, nothing good happens after dark. So don't put yourself into those situations, whether you're in the United States or in any foreign country. But with that being said, all the years that we have spent in Korea, I have never felt unsafe. Now, there were places that I shouldn't have gone as a young single soldier and being drunk and in the shadier parts of town, and even then, I did not feel unsafe. There's some confrontations that I had witnessed where people had taken obvious steps that were against the Korean laws, and those service members paid the price for it because they caused excessive force. And it's unfortunate because I think everybody who comes to Korea should be briefed on the self-defense laws of South Korea or any country that you go to so that you know how to act and behave. Because if you're operating with the way things are done in your home country and you try to do those same things in a foreign country and they're different, that could land you in a lot of trouble. So again, knowing is half the battle right there. And if you know the laws of the country that you're in, then you'll know how to behave and react and keep yourself out of trouble and your family members as well. So anyway, yeah, a lot of interesting information. I just wanted to go over this with people because people have asked me, what about self-defense in Korea? Can you carry a knife? Can you carry, the little keychain Kubotan things or whatever? You know what? It's not really a thing. They do have things like tasers, and I haven't looked into the legalities of that. I've seen them for sale here in Korea, but it's just not something I would be comfortable doing because I'm a foreigner. I'm on a visa. I'm 6'2" and I'm 250 pounds. So anything that I do is going to be deemed as excessive just because of my size and stature. It'd be very different for somebody like my wife, who's 5'3" and weighs $110. If she did the exact same thing as I did, because of her stature and her weight and her build, she would be given more leniency than somebody like me. So again, all the totality of circumstances comes into play as well. Now, here's some bonus information that people have been asking me is, what about firearms in Korea? because a lot of people know in my old YouTube, I had like 800 videos on firearms and gun reviews and shooting and all kinds of cool stuff. Shoot, move, and communicate, and running around vehicles and shooting shooting out of moving vehicles and running downrange doing courses of fire. I loved shooting. I taught shooting, and I have to say I was pretty good at it. I had a lot of firearms. I had a lot of ammunition, and I loved doing that stuff. So people have asked me, was it hard to give up your firearms when you moved to Korea? Absolutely. But I've gotten over it because the safety here in Korea is way better than what we experienced in the United States. So that's really comforting to me and my wife. The other thing is, well, can you still own a firearm in Korea? Because they see that there's hunting and there's shooting competitions at times. And the answer is yes, but there's a lot of caveats. You can own a firearm here in Korea, but you need to get permits, you need to get tested, you need to display that you know the safety rules that Korea has. But there's some other big buts. And one of those big buts is that I can own a firearm here in Korea, but I cannot store it in my house. So people are like, well, what do you mean? I would have to store my firearm in a designated police station, and it would have to be kept there until I used it for a sporting competition or hunting. The other thing that comes into play, the other big but, is that ammunition is severely regulated here in Korea. So I can't remember exactly the amount of ammunition that you could purchase and use in a year, but that amount is kind of like what I would shoot in an afternoon at the range. So yeah, it's again, it's for the safety of the people. And basically what happened, to give you a little bit of background in Korea, is that after the Korean War, there was a lot of lawlessness. Think of like, the Old West back in the United States. There was a lot of people who had guns, there was a lot of criminals, and the economy was bad, and it was just after the war. And then what Korea ended up doing is regulating firearms, and it got it to a point of where this atmosphere or this societal norm of we shouldn't have firearms because we want to protect ourselves as a whole, as Korean people. So we're going to do away or severely limit the use or acquisition of firearms. And that has been a real good thing. Gun crimes in Korea is extremely rare. And it's because most people don't have access to firearms and or ammunition. There is the point where people will say, well, we should do that in the United States. Well, the problem is that trying to enact that now, and also the Constitution that we have in the United States, you can't really do that. The genie's out of the bottle, and people protect themselves with firearms, and it's a very good thing in the United States. Matter of fact, according to FBI, about 200,000 women per year, on average, protect themselves from assaults, rapes, torture, and murder every single year. Sometimes the number is more, sometimes it's a little less, but it averages out to 200,000 people per year. This doesn't take into account the people that protect themselves from robberies, break-ins, home invasions, people who are elderly or infirmed. When Colt said, God made all men equal, and Colt ended up, I think the saying was, he ensured that if that happened or something like that. I forget the quote right off the top of my head. But yeah, if you have somebody who's old and infirmed and young punks come in and break into your house to steal, kill, and destroy, having a firearm levels out the playing field, and that's a very good thing. But the main differences between the United States and Korea is there's two totally different mindsets, and there's two totally different ways in which our countries have come up over the years. And in Korea, they just don't have a lot of firearms, where in the United States, they do have a lot of firearms, and there's pros and cons of each. But with that being said, it doesn't really bother me much that that I don't have access to firearms. I've come accustomed to that. And I really appreciate that most Koreans are on the side of public safety. So in other words, the majority of Koreans do They don't want to steal, kill, and destroy. They don't want to attack people. They want to live their lives, and they want to have a nice life and a nice life for their children. And so in this homogenous nation of Korea, as a group norm, the majority of people think that way. Whereas in the United States, we're seeing more and more criminals that are going against that societal norm, and they act out and attack. Another interesting thing is we have countries like Australia or England, and some people will point and say, well, we need to be like Australia and just outlaw guns. And kind of like, the UK and England, we need to outlaw guns so we can get rid of gun crimes. Well, when you outlaw countries that have already have firearms, the problem is that when you get rid of those firearms, only the criminals will have firearms. Or they'll just switch to another method in which they can steal, kill, and destroy. So, for example, in Australia and United Kingdom, when they took away the majority of people's ability to defend themselves with firearms, baseball bats, knives, clubs, all of those things, those crimes against people skyrocketed. So really, you traded one crime and reduced that amount of gun crime, but then in these other crimes with knives and baseball bats and all these other things escalated and just blew up. So really, did you really, help out the citizens of your country? In my opinion, no. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. That's just some extra bonus footage. So with that being said, I think it's really important that whether you go to Korea or whether you go to any other country overseas, not only is it important to know the do's and don'ts and, what about medical care and what about traveling and exchange rates and all of these different things, housing and paying bills and utilities, you should also know what it means to defend yourself and how that country defines it and how it enacts it and puts it into practice at, I guess, a realistic level. And there are some differences no matter where you go. And the more you know about those differences, the better you can behave and keep yourself out of trouble within those guidelines of that country. I hope that makes sense. So anyway, if you've got any experience with self-defense, or maybe you grew up in another country or visited another country and you can kind of clue us in or clue me in regards to self-defense laws in different countries that you've been to or lived in, put that in the comment section down below. If you didn't know anything about self-defense in the United States or Korea and you learned something new, hit that like button and subscribe, because eventually I'll post another video on Korea or 3D resin printing or exercise. There's kind of a mishmash of stuff, and the sub and the like would definitely help with the algorithm, and maybe someday I'll be able to monetize the channel, but I don't know. We'll see. I just do this as part of a hobby as being retired here in Korea, and hopefully help some other people out that come and visit. So with that being said, appreciate it. Thanks for watching. Again, comments, suggestions, tips, put them in the comment section down below, and eventually we'll get to it. All right, we'll see you on the next video. Peace. All right, now how do we close this down? All right, finish and broadcast.